We're going to continue in the Sodom and Gomorrah story. If you were or were not with us last time we were together, um, what we did is following last week when we talked about, studied through Genesis chapter 19 itself, the video for which is not yet up on YouTube. But during that one, I led us in reading and I commented on Genesis 19 um, up to the point of the story of Lot and his daughters and their incestuous circumstance that produced the two baby boys, Moab and Ammon. Now, Moab and Ammon, if you look at this map right here, you'll see Moab. And of course, this is the territory named after Moab, son of Lot. And I'm just going to figuratively say daughter number one. And then you see up here, Ammon, this region divided by the Arnon River Gorge, um, divides the countries or the territories of Moab later on in history after they became men and they established, I don't know if dynasties is the right word, but certainly very highly populated territories of their own. And Ammon, after which Ammon, spelled slightly differently, instead of Ammon, it's Amman today, but same word. Ammon, Jordan, which during this time, during the time of the conquest of Canaan, or the building of the Israelite nation was known as Rabbah. And so this is Moab, this is Ammon, and you probably know that the Moabites and the Ammonites, both of which nations are mentioned in the scriptures, both became thorny enemies of Israel and Judah. And so here they are Abraham's kinfolks through Lot and through Lot's daughters. But that's where their territories are located. Now, when last we were together, for those of you who were with us live, that was last Wednesday, what we began to do is to read through and to reference, that is, to skip certain scriptures, not because they're not urgently important, but because we've already read them and studied them, and there are videos that attest to that. So y'all can go back, people watching on YouTube or elsewhere in the future can go back and see those. But what we did is we looked at all 47, we began to look at all 47 mentions of Sodom in the Bible. Now, sometimes Sodom is mentioned by itself, presumably because it was the chief of all of these cities of the plain. And what we do see in the archaeological record is large fortified cities, now in ruins, buried very frequently, that seem to have satellite cities around them. Not like Gregory, Portland, like where we are now at, that even though one is larger than the other, they're considered equal within the school district and those kinds of things. But more like we would refer to Corpus Christi, would say, well, if we're in Dallas or if we're in maybe in New Orleans or somewhere, somebody would say, well, where are you from? Well, if you just want to give a short answer, what would you say? You'd say, well, I'm from Corpus Christi, Texas, because it's part of the larger area. You may or may not. But if they say, really, then they probably understand. Like if they said, well, I'm from Dallas, or I'm from New Orleans, or I'm from Austin. Okay, but where specifically are you located? People get that. Well, the Bible sort of uses that same idea in that Sodom is a catch-all phrase that includes all of the rest. However, sometimes these texts mention all the names of the cities that were specifically mentioned in the Genesis narrative, or most of them, and it says, and y'all look at me again. I did this on Wednesday, but I'm making a point for a teaching illustration. Count them: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim. Zeboim is dual. It is plural in Hebrew, but it's specifically the way it's put together. That little construction grammatically means two, not three, not four, not five, but two. So Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and the two Zeboim. Okay. Now Zoar is also mentioned, and that's of course where Lot fled with his daughters. But that's a little bit of background. Now, when we were together last, we read together and commented on Genesis 10. And if you're taking notes, here's the cross references again. I'm not going to reread these, but I'm going to catch us up. Genesis 10, 15 through 20. Genesis 10, 15 through 20. Genesis 13, 8 through 13. Genesis 13, 8 through 13. And then we previously studied the text about Abram going to rescue Lot, chasing down Chedorlaomer, and then meeting up with Melchizedek. And that's in Genesis chapter 14. And specifically, the text that mentions Sodom is verses 8 through 22. And you'll see why I'm not rereading these, because they're big chunks of text. Okay, and then just in the last couple of weeks, we've gotten through studying Genesis chapter 18, verses 16 through 26. And this is where the three visitors, one of them being Yahweh, or the pre-incarnate Jesus, and the two angelic beings visiting Abraham in his portable town is a good way to put it. I said that in his camp, but then I corrected myself and said, well, if Abraham was camping, he was glamping, because he was well supplied, well equipped. So that was in Genesis 18, verses 16 through 26. And then Genesis 19, verses 1 through 19, or 29, Genesis 19, 1 through 29, is the text that talks about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah itself, which I'm just sort of idealistically, non-idealistically is the best way to put it, representing with this graphic. And then now we're in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 20, beginning, well, I've selected some verses, okay? Verse 23, chapter 29 of Deuteronomy. Verse 23 is the one that specifically mentions Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities of the plain. And by the way, I think it would be authentic to the Bible, to the cultures, to the land, to the geography, and based upon observations that I've been blessed to make while being on the ground there. What you see when you go around the region where we excavate, and others all over Israel, Jordan, Syria, down in Egypt, Lebanon, other places, is you will see whether or not these cities are on tells, that is, hills, occupational mounds that were occupied over thousands of years of history. What you see is you'll see a large city that was fortified. That means had defensive gates and walls, towers, parapets, firing positions on these towers. The towers were designed to be set out away from the walls. Not only were they higher than the top of the walls the tops of the walls that were already very tall, but they came out from the wall. Why? Because you can't easily fire at people who are trying to sap, that is, to undermine your walls, to dig under them and cause them to collapse so they can get into your city. You can't easily fire at them leaning over the wall, because why? Your shoulder won't pull a bow like this, right? But if you have a tower that's sticking out like this from the wall, you can get in different positions and you can pull your bow at a full draw and then lean over like this, and you've got the opportunity to be in a better firing position. And so they had, what we see is these large fortified cities that were fortified with all the things I just mentioned, and they're particularly big compared to others around them. And the others around them might be half a mile, 2, 3, 4, 5 miles away, very frequently fortified, but some are what we would refer to as ephemeral villages. In other words, they could have been ephemeral, like Abraham's campsite, which moved around. In other words, he'd be in one location temporarily. His tents and all that are permanent or semi-permanent, but he moves around. And so it's hard to see evidence of those kinds of things except for cooking fires and those things where the ground is scorched. Maybe, a few artifacts like broken pottery, maybe the bases of spear points and arrow points that were broken either in battle or through hunting. And what are they doing? Well, they're sitting there in their off time and they're unwinding the wrappings of those things and throwing those little broken bases, kind of like this arrow point that I'm wearing. The base here might have snapped off because maybe the projectile hit a rock or hit a bone or something. And so they would unwrap that. They'd recover their arrow shaft with the fletchings, the feathers on the back that made them fly true. They'd unwind those things. They'd discard these pieces. So ephemeral camps are very difficult to find. But when we find a bunch of those kinds of things, we say, well, there's a fire here, maybe a broken jar because one of the kids ran through the camp and broke a yogurt jar or something. And we don't find much else. But then we have ephemeral villages or static villages that are there for a long time, but they're close enough to the fortified city that people can run to the cities, right? And as they're approaching, they're screaming, the Ammonites are coming, or the Amorites are coming, or the Amalekites are coming. Let us in, and they're opening the gates, right? Letting them in. They go there for protection. So what we see is in the Canaanite world, which is what I think we're seeing here with Sodom and Gomorrah. We're seeing a Canaanite or Canaanitish type of world where you've got a very large city, maybe a couple of them that are pretty big. And by large, I'm talking about, well, Jerusalem during the Middle Bronze Age time of Abraham was about 10 acres in the city walls. Now, Gregory, Texas, George West, Texas is way more than 10 acres, but we're not trying to build walls around those towns, right? Think if you have to make mud bricks and lay foundations and build towers and all that, what are you going to try to fortify? Will you fortify a big town or two or three in, maybe successively smaller, and then the people in the hinterlands and the farmlands around, they jump on their critters, or they get in their wagons and load everybody up with a few urgently needed things, and they go to the big city and they enclose. Jericho was about 13 acres. Now our side at Tal El Hammam, we believed, was 64 acres inside the walls, and that was true. We've now discovered, and we need more confirmation, but it seems that they might have had an outer wall that encompassed about 250 acres. Well, that's the size of a deer lease in South Texas, right? Not the biggest ones, but that's a lot to put mud bricks around, 100 feet high. So wow. Well, only as far as we know, Hatzor, right here, which the Bible says Joshua burned with fire and put its king to the edge of the sword, and Ashkelon here in the south on the Mediterranean coast. As far as I know, only Hatzor, Ashkelon, and Tal El Hammam during the Bronze Age were 250 acres enclosed. And we, like I said, we still need to confirm our site. But this kind of gives you a feel. Okay, so this was a big place, and it had satellite towns and villages, including right outside its walls. If you were standing there looking off the walls and the towers, there were little houses all over the place, and two perennial rivers that went around the city. And so it was well watered, and so they were able to sustain themselves. We now know from the archaeology at our site, even through major times of famine, the city never went offline, even during the intermediate Bronze Age, which is before this time of Abraham and after the early Bronze Age. Our site has continuous occupation, and almost no other sites in the entire region existed during that time because they just didn't have the water. So this kind of gives you the picture of what's going on historically there, um, even though we're without historical records. So Deuteronomy 29, beginning in verse 1, if anybody would like to read, the microphone is there, and we'll pass it to you. And that way it can be captured for our video. If nobody wants to read, I'll be glad to read. Okay, honey. Thank you. Well, let's see. Let's go 1 through 29, and then I'll go back and highlight a few things and talk about verse 23 just briefly.
Deuteronomy 29:1. These are the terms of the covenant the Lord commanded Moses to make with the Israelites while they were in the land of Moab, in addition to the covenant he had made with them at Mount Sinai. Moses summoned all the Israelites and said to them, "You have seen with your own eyes everything the Lord did in the land of Egypt to Pharaoh and to all of his servants and to his whole country, all the great tests of strength, the miraculous signs, and the amazing wonders. But to this day the Lord has not given you minds that understand, nor eyes that see, nor ears that hear. For 40 years I led you through the wilderness, yet your clothes and sandals did not wear out. You ate no bread and drank no wine or other alcoholic drink, but he gave you food so you would know that he is the Lord your God." When he came here, King Sihon of Heshbon, the king of Og and Bashan, came out to fight against us, but we defeated them. We took their land and gave it to the tribes of Reuben and Gad and to the half-tribe of Manasseh as their grant of land. Therefore, obey the terms of this covenant so that you will prosper in everything you do. All of you, tribal leaders, elders, officers, all of the men of Israel, are standing today in the presence of the Lord your God. Your little ones and your wives are with you, as well as foreigners living among you, who chop your wood and carry your water. You are standing here today to enter into the covenant of the Lord your God. The Lord is making this covenant, including the curses. By entering into the covenant today, he will establish you as his people and confirm that he is your God, just as he promised you and as he swore to your ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But you are not the only ones with whom I am making this covenant with its curses. I am making this covenant both with you who stand here today in the presence of the Lord your God, and also with future generations who are not standing here today. You remember how we lived in the land of Egypt and how we traveled through the lands of enemy nations as we left. You have seen their detestable practices and their idols made of wood, stone, silver, and gold. I am making this covenant with you, so that no one among you, no man, woman, clan, or tribe, will turn away from the Lord our God to worship these gods and other nations, and so that no root among you bears bitter and poisonous fruit. Those who hear the warnings of this curse should not congratulate themselves, thinking, I am safe, even though I am following the desires of my own stubborn heart. This would lead to utter ruin. The Lord will never pardon such people. Instead, his anger and jealousy will burn against them. All the curses written in this book will come down on them, and the Lord will erase their names from under heaven. The Lord will separate them from all the tribes of Israel to pour out on them all the curses of the covenant recorded in this book of instruction. Then the generations to come, both your own descendants and the foreigners who come from distant lands, will see the devastation of the land and the diseases the Lord inflicts on it. They will exclaim, the whole land is devastated by sulfur and salt. It is a wasteland with nothing planted and nothing growing, not even a blade of grass. It is like the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord destroyed in his intense anger. And all the surrounding nations will ask, why has the Lord done this to the land? Why is he so angry? And the answer will be, this happened because the people of the land abandoned the covenant that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. Instead, they turned away to serve and worship gods they had not known before, gods that were not from the Lord. That is why the Lord's anger has burned against the land, bringing down on it every curse recorded in this book. In great anger and fury, the Lord uprooted his people from their land and banished them to another land where they still live today. The Lord our God has secrets known to no one. We are not accountable for them, but we and our children are accountable forever for all that he has revealed to us, so that we may obey all the terms of these instructions.
Thank you, sweetheart. Okay, let's go back and just look at a few things. Now, again, we're in Deuteronomy, so this is at least 3 centuries after the time of Abraham. Okay, so I think this is occurring in the upper 1300s BC. Okay, scholars and Bible students are divided about when they think the Exodus took place. I think it took place around 1400 or a little bit after. Some think it happened in the 1200s. Some think it happened earlier in the middle part of the 15th century in the 1400s. But in any case, notice what's going on here. This is the book of Deuteronomy. This is chapter 29. The book of Deuteronomy is almost concluded at this point, and it was written somewhere around the plains of Moab, near Mount Nebo, which is shown right here on this map, which is in the range, the mountain range of Pisgah. So if you read Pisgah, Pisgah, or Nebo, Nebo, they're talking about the same area. Sometimes they're used completely interchangeably. And so Moses knows he's soon going to die. He's writing this book of the law. My translation here says, Cindy read for us out of the NLT, which uses the word instruction. And so in the Hebrew Bible, when you read the word Torah, and sometimes we call it Pentateuch, the 5 books, the Torah is often translated law in our English Bibles, but instruction or way or pathway, this is the idea. All of these are good translations. If you said, well, the law of the Lord to the ancient Israelites, what was it? It was God's path. It was his roadway for their understanding, okay? And so what's Moses doing? He's reminding the children of Israel not to stray from the word of the Lord. Now, this passage that Cindy just read for us sounds a little bit terse. There's a lot of warnings in it, talks of curses, right? And some people therefore say, well, Yahweh is not a very loving God. Well, is a parent a very loving parent if their little one is running in the street and they don't go out and grab them by the hand or snatch them up and swat their rear end and tell them no? Well, no. It's people think that a swat on the backside is child abuse, but what is letting them be in danger of being run over by a car? You know, the world has gone insane. So what is Yahweh doing? Okay, he's given them the Torah, the law, the instruction, the pathway. But what's he done? He's put guardrails on the sides of it. And he's strictly warned them. If you do this, this is going to bring about horrible circumstances in your lives. That's what a good father does. And notice what he says in verse 29. Now, this reads a little differently from Cindy's, but I want to highlight a certain word. The secret things belong to the Lord, to the Master, Adonai, our God. But the things revealed to us and to our children forever. I'm sorry, let me reread it. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever. In other words, there's things that God retains in his own wisdom, his own mind. Nevertheless, there are things that the Lord has revealed to us and to our children. What did Moses write according to the Lord's command in Deuteronomy chapter 6? Teach the words of my instruction to your children. Write them on the doorposts of your houses so that when you go out and when you come in, you read them, you see them. The Lord is continually in Deuteronomy referring to the people as his children. He is their father, although that terminology as father is not very frequently used in the Old Testament. Of course, Jesus uses it all the time. So here's what I want you to know. If you go to Deuteronomy, if you want to go to the Deuteronomy chapter 1, where the chapter begins, and make a notation for your notes, you might write down something like this: that Deuteronomy is about Yahweh's covenant love for his children. His covenant love. That's what Deuteronomy is about. So what's the Lord doing? He's trying to keep his children during the time of Moses and Joshua as they're getting ready to enter into the land of promise. He's saying, don't be like Sodom and Gomorrah, as he mentioned in verse 23. He says in verses 2 through 6, remember how I delivered you out of Egypt? Remember that the Exodus, their deliverance from Egypt, is what? It's the salvation story of the Old Testament. Of course, you can't compare anything to the cross of Christ as far as its salvific nature and work, right? The way it saves. But the Exodus deliverance out of Egypt, it was their salvation. And the Lord always reminds them, remember when I delivered you out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. In other words, I reached out and I grabbed a hold of Pharaoh. And I inflicted judgment upon the false gods of Egypt for the deliverance of my people. So we're about to end. And then verse 7 and 8. And when you got to the land on this side of the Jordan, what did I do? I helped you. I caused you to be able to defeat King Og and Sihon, the giant kings, right? And then verse 9 and following, look at this incrementally. Carefully follow the terms of this covenant so that you may prosper in everything you do. Okay, he's giving them step-by-step things that he wants them to be aware of. Verse 22, your children who follow you in later generations and foreigners who came from distant lands will see the calamities that have fallen on the land and the diseases with which the Lord has afflicted it. In other words, if you obey the words of my covenant, what's going to happen? You're going to enjoy blessing. But if not, even the nations around you are going to see that when you disobey me, Yahweh, the blessing ceases. Now, in verse 22, 23, 24, what does he do? In verse 23, he says, the whole land is going to become destitute. If you depart from me, you worship pagan gods, you worship idols that are detestable to him, like he says up around verse 16 and following, like the one in our museum, the head of which was broken off and the horns of which were broken off, and then we repaired it without the horns just so you can see what it looked like. We're reminded of how God instructed the people of Israel and Judah later to always destroy these high places, these idols, these shrines, these temples of the pagan gods. And then, verse 22, he says, your children and generations after are going to see if you do wrongly, you're going to become like Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim. And I think that here the Lord didn't just use Sodom, he talked about all 5 of the key cities. Why? Because he's trying to make a firm statement. Verse 25, the answer will be, it's because the people abandoned the covenant of the Lord. And then in verse 29 again, but he's revealed things that belong to us and our children forever, so that we may follow in the words of the law. Okay, here's where we end with this statement. If the people do what is right in the sight of the Lord, they'll be blessed. But if not, notice how Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and the Zeboim have become a descriptive catchphrase for cursing. And it's not that the Lord ever again rained down fire and burning stones from the heavens upon any cities, but they would likewise become destitute, and that's the point.